David Bohm Seminar Series 2, Friday evening, December 1st, 1989, Oak Grove School, Ojai, California.
Let's see, this is the fourth year, and this is probably the largest group we've had. Am I audible now? Yes. Not yes or no?
Yes.
No.
Oh, no.
Well, shall we do something? Okay. Now, sometimes I like to begin by asking people to ask questions or ask whatever's on their mind, so we get some sense of what is on people's minds before we start. It doesn't mean I'll answer all the questions. Well, I'll keep them in mind, you see, but the purpose is not necessarily to get an answer, but just for communication, right? Mainly, and also I may answer some of them. So perhaps we'll start. 10 or 15 minutes like this is what I suggest, not to go too long, right? Yes.
Is there a difference between the brain and the mind? The brain, is subject to all the chemical reactions and everything in our body. Is there something?
Could you speak up, please?
Oh, is there a difference between the brain and the mind? The brain, is subject to all our chemical reactions and everything. Is there something other than that?
Yes. Is there a difference between the brain and the mind? A very difficult question. Some people believe the brain is all there is, and others say there's something beyond a mind which might not even be individual. And perhaps we will get to that, you see, but it's interesting that there are people here who want to know about it.
Fitting into that perhaps might be a rather vague question that I have about indicative thought and how that arises.
Indicative thought. Now, what is that? What do you...
Well, many years ago, I remember a talk that you gave about reflective thought and indicative thought. And indicative thought generally points out what not to do more than what to do. It indicates.
Yes, there is thought which reflects on things and thought which might point out, thought which might do other things. I will discuss some of the general nature of thought during this seminar, also what I call participatory thought and some other things which we'll get to, right?
Do you have a purpose for this seminar? Do you have a goal?
Well, and I wouldn't say I have a definite goal. No, I think we would like to discuss some notions about thought, really. And in general, as the years have gone on, we've got more material than can be discussed in one seminar anyway. There has to be some selection. And I would like to communicate so we could not merely discuss, but have what I call at least the spirit of a dialogue. A dialogue being something where people participate and share, right? And where they will listen without trying to come to a conclusion, right? We will listen to each other and to everything. And perhaps by seeing the meaning of it all, truth will emerge unannounced, you see, rather than saying we're going to try to arrive at truth as our goal, right? So there's a kind of vague purpose in my mind, but it's not all that well defined, right?
What is the difference between thinking and thought?
Yes, the difference between thinking and thought. We will discuss that.
What are the obstacles to dialogue?
Yes, well, we'll discuss that too maybe later on, but the obstacles to dialogue are really people holding to fixed opinions and defending them, you see, and also the belief, each person believing that he's got truth and so on. And those are some of the obstacles. But we'll go into that.
Would you say the
Consciousness is a thing?
Is consciousness a thing? Well, I'd say no. No, but that would be an interesting question. You see, what does the word thing mean?
Versus a process.
Yes, or even is consciousness a process? That's not certain either, right? See, what is consciousness? That's your question, really. What is to be meant by consciousness?
People approach it as if it's a thing, and if it's not a thing, then that approach would be incorrect.
Yeah. So is there such a thing as consciousness? Some people want to say there isn't, right? For different reasons.
Look at what is going on in the world, especially the quick transformations between the two superpowers and our relationship to that.
Yes, what's going on in the world? Well, we'll discuss that too. I mean, I'm not sure how much attention we can say about this transformation and the superpowers right now, but we will, several questions we want to go into.
Go into creativity.
Creativity, yes. Well, we'll try perhaps to look at that too, yes. Now we're getting at least some idea of the interests of people here, you see. So I think this is part of dialogue for people to realize what's on each other's minds, right? Without coming to any conclusions or, judgments or anything.
Questions that have been asked are really indicative of what people actually are thinking.
I don't know. I mean, it does indicate what's on their mind to some, at least it's enough on their mind to ask a question, right?
And in terms of, in such a large group, to really say what's on a person's mind, if it involves some uncertainty, some question that they're not sure of, they may be less inclined to open it.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I mean, many people may not be so sure what's on their mind and they don't want to talk about it, right? Well, at least those who are more sure then will tell me.
Could we perhaps discuss what the factor or environment or conditions are under which change takes place?
Yes, what are the factors under which determining whether change, transformation takes place? Right? Yes, we'll have to discuss, we may get to that. I mean, I would change the question to what are the factors preventing transformation? Right? Yes, and when they are not present, then I say there will be transformation.
Before the weekend is over, I'd like to say something about, I'm interested in Gregory Bateson's work in communication, and he took Russell's work in the theory of logical types, and he decided that Russell decided that there was an order of orders, and that paradoxes were a confusion of logical type, and Gregory Bateson took that and worked with it, and his last work before he died was an oscillation theory of communication and relationships. And I was struck by the fact that you have a very fascinating kind of arcane oscillation theory. And I wondered whether there was a relationship.
Well, yes, you want to. No, I don't know if there is one. You see, I've only studied Bateson in a very limited way, so I couldn't say. But maybe the question, if you notice one, we could bring it up. I mean, what do you mean by arcane? Do you mean hidden or difficult? Right? Anybody else?
I'm thinking of a question I had as a young child that was never answered, and I still wonder about it some decades later. Is there a difference in the way individuals experience thought, their own internal process? Do some people think in words, and some people think in pictures, and some people have imagination and others have none? Does it differ from individual to individual? Does that have something to do with why people behave so differently?
Is there a difference in the way people think? Well, yes, well, we could perhaps come to that. Perhaps fundamentally not, but there may be a difference in what people emphasize in their thinking. Some are more on one side, some are more on the other. I don't think there's an absolute difference, but some people would think more in pictures and some more in some other way. But perhaps, no, that may come up later, theoretically.
Is truth a process or is truth a fact?
Yes, well, we'll have to discuss the nature of truth. You see, I don't think we can really say that right now. It will come up, right? Oh. Is there any more? We could have one or two more, and then...
Could we discuss the process of thought going into feeling and then back into thought and in a sense getting rid of the bad thought of anger, fear, or emotion that one's aware of?
Yes, we will discuss the relationship of thought and feeling and all that, yes.
But this raises a question for me, and is there a difference between emotion and feeling?
Is there a difference between emotion and feeling? Yes, well, that depends on how you use the language, right? But we'll discuss thought, emotion, feeling, physical sensations, various things that are related, right? Well, it's sort of already getting an outline of what we're going to do, right?
Isn't any discussion at all essentially meaningless, because words themselves are a paradox. Words are essentially a symbol for what? And if you go into a word, you'll find a paradox. That's fundamental. So the words we use, in that sense, don't get anywhere.
Well, the words you say are a paradox, right? That communication breaks down. And communication breaks down.
Breaks down, yes.
Yes, well, I suggest that there is a lot of paradox in language, but that communication may still be possible. You see, that if we say there's no communication at all, that you can't maintain that, right? Because you then couldn't even say that, right? You see, in some sense, I will discuss this all later, but in some sense you're trusting to words to tell me that words are paradoxical and that I know what you mean, right?
On a certain level,
yeah.
On the level in which we're operating.
Yeah, but paradox is a very subtle concept. And you see, you're trusting words to communicate that, right?
Pardon?
You're trusting words to communicate the notion of paradox, which is a very subtle thing. You see, in other words, I don't think we can just simply say that words don't do anything, because when you say that, you're already trusting to words to say it, right? You see, we have to say there's a lot of trouble with words, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely, totally impossible. Do you see? No, we're somewhere in between. And so we admit that words are causing a lot of trouble in communication, but anybody who says that must assume that words can communicate something. You see, it's the same as the question of cynicism, that somebody cannot be cynical about everything, because he would then have to be cynical about his cynicism too, you see. But he takes that seriously, you see. So you can't do it, you see. Right, well, I think there's room for just one more question.
I was wondering if you have thought about any difference or uniqueness in masculine and feminine thinking processes.
Yes, is there a difference of masculine and feminine thinking processes? Well, there surely is some difference, but the question is how fundamental is it, you see. I don't know, it may, if you like, you could bring it up sometime, you see. Now, right, unless somebody has another question he really wants.
I'm interested in the movement, the negation. And does it have its own movement?
Does negation have its own movement? Now, what does that mean?
Well, it seems, negation seems so dead, or, you know, is there I mean, does it have a movement? Is there I mean, are you alive when you're in negation?
Oh, yeah. No, isn't it? Well, but surely negation is a part of the whole process, because if things are wrong, or if you think they're wrong, then you negate them. You say that they're confused or wrong, or it's part of the whole process of thought is negation, right?
Negation and positives.
Yeah, they're both two sides of it.
I guess I mean like electricity or something.
Yeah, well, but negation is one side of thought, and assertion, positing is the other, right? To posit and to negate, right? To posit means to put forth, and to negate means to oppose, right? And both are necessary as part of the movement of thought, right? Right. All right, well, I think then, that's about it. It doesn't, we've got most of the questions that people feel. And now, you may have gathered already that we're going to be discussing thought, you see. So many of you have been here before, anyway, know that. I'm suggesting that thought is behind the major ills and difficulties of the human species. Now, this may seem strange if you've never heard it before, because thought is considered to be, by many, the highest achievement of the human species. And I'm not trying to say it has no value. It is a very important achievement, but at the same time, it is a tremendously dangerous thing, as it's a double-edged sword, right? Now, see, you may realize that in many ways the world is in a critical situation in the last few years, or even for quite a bit longer. The nuclear problem seems to have receded to some extent, but somebody remarked there are great changes going on in Eastern Europe, with certain dangers, but there over the past several thousand years there have been tremendous amount of chaos, you see, of wars and slavery and oppression and economic disorder and all sorts of things. And it seems to have led to something new now, that we are now in danger of destroying the whole planet. We have been for quite a while, just by our ordinary everyday activities of life, right? These are more dangerous than the nuclear bombs and all the other stuff, because they are using up everything. They're destroying forests and agricultural land and jungle and changing the climate. And I don't want to detail it all. You must have read it, that very severe changes could take place. Everybody agrees on that. The only question is when, right? Some experts say 50 years, some say it'll be longer, some think it's 100 or 200. But if we don't change this, it's fairly certain that a real disaster will occur, of magnitude we can hardly imagine. No? There isn't a lot of time. Now, and you can say, well, you have all these ecological problems. What shall we do? Shall we save the whales? Shall we save the jungle? Shall we fight to do this, this, and this? All that's all right, but it's only slowing it down, right? The question is, the ecology is no problem, really. It got along for many millions of years, and until we came along. See, we are the problem, right? Why are we the problem? See, what's the source of it? I say the source of it is in the way we think, right? It is our thinking that has led us to believe that we could just exploit the earth indefinitely. As we believe we can have wars indefinitely and we can do all sorts of things indefinitely that we're used to doing, right? And now, this is all a certain way of thinking. Now, the first characteristic of this way of thinking is just fragmentation, you see, which means breaking things up or smashing things up. It doesn't mean dividing things. You see, you can divide between the sheep and the goats or anything like that. You know, useful plants and dangerous plants, and this is quite all right. But if we divide between things that are united, then we say we try to smash them, right? So they agree with our division, right? See, between nations, I say we have actually a tight connection. It's not a loose connection. Everybody depends on everybody else economically. The ecology is all one. Yet every nation says it's sovereign, which means it can do exactly what it likes. Nobody can tell it what to do, right? That's been a principle for a long, long time. And people find it hard to change. You see, the Brazilians are cutting down their jungle, some of them, but they object to our talking about it because they say you northerners who are prosperous are producing a lot more carbon dioxide than us. Why do you tell us what to do with our jungles, which anyway is ours? And we would probably answer back, who are you to tell us what to do with our industries, you see? See, but as long as we're pretending we're all separate, right? And we can all do what we like, but you see, it can't be done. Huh? Now, but that pretense that we're separate is a way of thinking. You see, nations were invented by thought, right? There was a time every nation was invented by somebody thinking, we've got a nation. We've got a lot of nations now that didn't exist 100 years ago, when just people declared we exist and that's it, right? Then you say everything must be sacrificed for that nation. And we must destroy the world for that nation, and so on. You see, so we also have fragmentation all around, and between religions, say between families, between ideologies, between different professions. You see that everything is broken up. Everything which is really united is in our thought all broken up. So we have a fictitious way of thinking. And if we think in a fictitious way, we are going to get in trouble. So the question is, why do we have this? See, this fictitious way of thinking breaks things up wrongly and it unites them wrongly. It says nations are united. You see, they're all one, but they're not. Inside each nation is tremendous division. You can see it obviously. So they pretend there's unity where there is none, and they pretend there's division where there is none, you see. And everybody sees it that way. So the question is, why are we doing it? Because of our thinking, right? We're used to thinking that way. We've been thinking that way for ages, and it seems people now defend that way of thinking. See, if you tried to really question it, people would get annoyed, right? They would finally say you're making trouble if you kept it up, right? And so on and so on. The fact is that they're making trouble, right? We're getting ready to destroy the whole planet, not merely the human race, but everything else, in order to go on with their habits of thought and all the other things that I've got used to, right? Now, as long as we have this division, it's going to be extremely hard to make the extraordinary change that is going to be needed to meet this ecological problem. We have got to change everything unimaginably radically. I don't want to go into all that, but for just one example, we have to stop growth, economic growth, right? Now, we have to stop population growth. So, how are we going to do it, you see? Now, there's thought that's causing the trouble, right? It's the collective thought of the human race. It's not just an individual. It's passed on, you see. Now, the point is, we get in trouble when you say thought is doing all this. People won't believe it because they say thought is nothing. You see, it's just reflecting on reality, telling you the way things are, and then you decide what to do, right? That's the common view, right? But of course, if you present reality in a certain way, this is going to influence what you're going to do, right? You see, the FBI used to say, we merely present information, It's up to the whoever it is to use it, right? But merely putting information in a certain form has a powerful effect, right? So if we put it in the form that nations are all different and independent, we are going to behave accordingly. You see, information is not just sitting there, it's very powerful. And thought in general is very powerful. It has produced everything. You see, it's produced this building, it's produced cities, it's produced farmland, it's produced industry, it's produced governments, it's produced religions, it's produced schools, it's produced technology and science. It's produced almost everything. You see, it's almost impossible now to find a part of the world that was not influenced by thought. And there's hardly a part so wild, right? But thought doesn't want to acknowledge this. The whole process of thought, whatever it is set up to say, I'm not doing it. You see, I didn't do it, right? Right? It's just there. And there it is, a problem, the ecological problem, right? And I've got to think about it some more, right? So I'll think about it saying, well, we've got to stop cutting down those trees. We've got to stop killing the whales and whatever. So we've got to stop producing all that carbon dioxide. We've got to do all sorts of things. And the thought also says we have got to have more fuel. We've got to have a higher standard of living, but we've got to produce more industry. And says we cannot possibly get rid of growth, right? So it's impossible. You see, so the question is, it's got to stop sometime. You see, if it grows 2.5% per year, it will grow 10 times in 100 years, 10,000 million times in 1,000 years. So it'll really crush everything. Sometime it's got to stop. You see, so nobody has ever thought about that, right? A few, right? You see, so thought says we've got to grow, and thought says we've got to get rid of the consequences of growth. You see, we've got it's incoherent. You see, it says we've got to grow without these consequences. Now some improvements of technology could help that, but in the end, you see, you can't win. You see, if it's going to grow in 1,000 years, you cannot imagine any technology which will overcome 10,000 million times. See, or 100 years even is impossible. So we might grow for a while, but we can't just keep on growing. You see, now, so thought is constantly producing consequences and saying, I didn't do it, and says, I've got to overcome the consequences. So that's incoherent, right? It means you produce results you don't intend, and you also start deceiving yourself. In order to avoid facing the issue. Okay, so that's the second point. Now, the third point is that we have produced so many things, thought has produced so many things of all kinds that would be very hard to change. We say all these industrial arrangements, all this trade, right? Our cities, our electricity, it's all there. You see, we can't change it, right? So we've got to go on with it. You see, that's typical of thought. You see that it's constantly producing consequences and saying it didn't do it, and then it says I can't change it, right? It's too difficult. Now, what are we going to do with that, you see? Now, what we've got to do is to start understanding thought better. You see, we're saying we have been run by the process of thought, right? We don't realize that thought requires attention. Our whole tradition, it's been going on for thousands of years. It didn't start yesterday, right? The Romans were destroying forests several thousand years ago, and North Africa was the most fertile part of the world, and it was turned into a desert, you see, by just cutting down all those trees. Now, we can do it much faster, you see, with chainsaws. we can produce deserts at a greater rate, but you see, technology is not the answer, because technology will do whatever thought tells us we want to do, right, or we've got to do. See, if thought says we've got to cut down trees, we've got to have more money, we've got to have more products, we will use the technology, we'll invent technology that does that, right? So science and technology cannot be the answer. You see, something more fundamental is needed, right? There's no technological fix to this. You see, there's got to be a change in thought, you see. Now, that is not so easy.
You don't mean a change in thinking positively that I'm self-deceptive or we should change the cities, but the process of thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we've somehow got to change this process that's getting us in deeper all the time, you see. See, all the means by which we try to solve these problems are making them worse, right? You know, suppose you say, well, the problem is poverty. You see, for a long time it was poverty. I said, well, we'll try to have industry to make people less poor, but it really hasn't got very far because very large parts of the world are even poorer than they were, but some parts are more wealthy. But now, even at that, if we keep on growing and making these people richer, we're going to have the ecological crisis. You can't keep on making people richer indefinitely. Right? The world won't support it. You see, the people hoped and believed that technology would grow so fast that you'd find a way, but you know, there's no evidence. And if you think that just growing and growing and growing, eventually the growth must prevail. You know, must win over anything you can invent, right? You know, there'll be just so many people in the world anyway that there's no room for them. Now, how are you going to change all that? The customs by which population is determined, by which goals are determined. People say, my goal in life is to make money, to get a home, to do this, to be comfortable. It's perfectly reasonable, apparently, and yet it all adds up to trouble, right? For each individual, it looks very reasonable. So people generally don't want to think about that, and they would rather not believe it, right? So part of thought is self-deception, which says it's not so. They give another explanation, right? So that's part of the process. To relieve the tension and pressure and discomfort of thinking that way, thought invents another explanation which is more reassuring. Now, the question is, what is behind all this kind of thought? Right?
Derive its power from someplace else.
Well, does it? I mean, we don't know. I mean, where would it derive it from?
It must just come out of something other than itself, and that must be if it could derive its power from the meaning.
How about instinctual needs? Because after all, as humans developed, that was the first source. Thought didn't spring sui generis, it sprang from instinctual needs.
Yes, but if the needs were for security and comfort or whatever, or for improving, one need was to take care of, find sources of food or something. But thought is now, it's surely not our need to destroy ourselves. If people were looking at needs, they would say, let's quick change our thought, right? They deceive themselves about what they need rather than face the issue, right? So thought has, there's something wrong, something incoherent in the process of thought that if it does that. See, thought to be useful should not engage in self-deception. It should not be incoherent, or it should not, at least it may be incoherent, but it should not defend incoherence, right?
Say that's the only way human beings have survived.
How?
By defending incoherence, by defending against realization of rationality.
Maybe, but I think that they're not going to survive very much longer that way. At least, therefore, either we say the human race is very badly designed and will disappear, or we say there's a mistake in thought that can be changed. Right now, some people say the human race is a bad job. Let's give it up. You see that's like people like Earth First say. Well, the main thing is to see that some of nature is preserved so that something new can take our place. Right? It's a very depressing point of view. But anyway, it's not even certain that it'll work, you see, because if we go down, we'll probably create such chaos as to bring everything down, you see. So the best way to preserve nature is to solve our problems.
Self-deception, you're talking about something that's in the essential nature of thought, or something that's learned?
That's my question. You see, let's look at the question, right? See, in a dialogue, we sort of have to weigh the question a little, right? Ponder it a little and see it, feel it out, right? Now, one view is that something is wrong with the human race. Well, that's pretty hopeless, right? Well,
doesn't leave much room.
You might hope that technology will develop so as to fix it for a while.
The division, though, that's occurred in humans, where some humans see this problem and have addressed it for centuries, even problems that are dividing us and causing these factions, and then others come out and say, no, you can't talk. Squash.
Yeah, well, they're frightened, you see, but thought creates fear, right? See, it's due to thought saying, if you say those things, you're going to disturb all our comfortable arrangements, and we don't want that, right? And then they say that in order to do that, people must deceive themselves, because they must say, we are not going to look at this, we are going to assume that everything is going to be all right. You see, so they defend themselves against evidence that something is wrong with the thought, right? Now, that's surely something wrong. It's not a good way to survive. When it comes to technical thought, people don't do it so much, right? If they did, the technology wouldn't work at all. They do it to some extent. For example, people who run nuclear plants have been accused of covering up weaknesses in what they're doing, right? Or not really covering it up, but in believing they're cover-up, right?
Part of thought, though, is to make the choice. And how do you choose rather than deceiving?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, how will you make a choice, you see, if you're not clear? You see, it's necessary for thought to be coherent. Now, can you choose to be coherent when you are incoherent? See, because we don't know why we're incoherent, right? I mean, nobody wants to be incoherent. Or at least I don't know of anybody.
Saying over time we've created a structure in thought that now it makes it very possible to be self-deceptive and incoherent and to have it seem to be quite reasonable. We've created a kind of structuring of thought.
Yeah. Well, something like that has happened. You see, the thought about religion is not coherent. You see, people will not listen. No two religions have ever managed to really have a dialogue, right? In which they would really listen to each other's assumptions.
Even religion has come out of the previous incoherence of understanding.
Yeah, but even religions that are very close, different branches of the same one, you see. Now, between nations, it's very hard to get coherent thought, right? Or between ideologies, or whenever anybody's interest or self-interest is involved, right?
We've identified ourselves more deeply with the problems of thought than we have with. We've identified ourselves more deeply with thought and the things we get out of it than with the obvious problems that thought's causing. We don't identify ourselves as deeply with the destruction of the earth as we do with the destruction of our thought processes.
Well, we identify ourselves with our self-interest, right?
Our thought process is intact.
Yeah, well, you see, our self-interest is identified with keeping our customary habits unchanged and our arrangements, the things that make us feel secure and that we satisfy us and so on, right?
And that we maintain this incoherence.
Yeah. Now, if it turns out that to do this involves contradiction and incoherence, then we cover it up, right? We deny that it's incoherent and we give a false explanation making it look coherent.
Why is it so important to be coherent?
All right, why? You see, if you're incoherent, one thing is you do not produce the intended results, right? That's one sign of incoherence. Another one is that you're contradicting yourself, you see. Or a third is you're deceiving yourself. Now, that sort of thought, which we say, what is the point of that thought? We'd be better off without it. If you say, see, nobody intends to destroy the planet. Nobody intended that. They merely intended to get rich, right? Well, comfortable, rich, whatever it was, right? Now, I'm not blaming anybody. You see, I'm saying all of us were in it, right? So we did not see that this was dangerous, right? It was incoherent. If our intention had been to destroy the planet, we would have been coherent.
Isn't part of the problem that we're so accustomed to being led that we don't know how to start on our own afresh with leading ourselves in the right direction?
Yeah, but no, who's leading whom, you see?
Suddenly one sees that thought is the culprit.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I'm living in a nation very comfortably, and I want to change my affiliation with the ignorance of collective thinking. And suddenly I'm alone, stranded perhaps, suddenly there's a fear that could come about that isn't even necessarily the fear I see in understanding thought.
It may be still involved in understanding. See, fear and thought are closely connected. We really have to go into that later, right? And see, one of our assumptions is that thought is one thing and fear is another, pleasure is another, anger is another, and so on, right? Yeah, all the emotions, and also the general stress in the body is another. The tensions and stresses, and what's going on in society is something else again, right? See, that's fragmentation. Now, thought traditionally over thousands of years has conditioned us to believe in that, right? Now, therefore, if you see fear, you say, well, that's not thought, right? But I suggest it may still be thought.
That we have to have some faith that there's enough time for us left to do this change in our thinking, and it seems that maybe we're just, when you mentioned Earth First, it seems like their idea is that, or I would translate it to be like that thought is making us think that we're so important above all the other species that that we'll be trying to solve these problems, that there won't be enough time and everything will be gone, us and everything else.
Yeah, well, we don't know about that. You see, some people estimate it's a short time and some longer, but you see, we don't know, right?
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, I wonder if thought is making us just think that we're just the most important species.
Yes, it's doing that too, yes. But in some sense we are, because we're able to destroy the whole thing. At least we're the key to it, right? Not in one sense we may not be, but in another sense we're the ones on which it all hinges, right? If we don't do it right, the whole thing may come down. Now,
It's kind of like a short-term view, isn't it?
What?
Well, the whole thing may come down.
Well, no, it may revive again later, clearly.
It's been around for 4 billion
Yeah.
years.
It will come back probably, and very probably, right? In some other way.
That's coming up for me is how can we think ourselves how can we use thought to get ourselves out of thought?
But we may have to still. You see, we're not trying to say that thought is entirely vicious or wrong, or thought is a mixture. It's in between. It's doing all these wrong things, and it's also capable of all sorts of other things. We may need something more than thought as well, but we may have to also have clear thought, right? About thought. That's one of the things we're coming to. You see, we're thinking about all sorts of things, but we have never said that it's very important to think clearly about thought. This may be the first step.
Isn't thought the product of memory? And isn't memory the result of millions of years of conditioning, like a program in a computer? So I always thought on that basis able to do anything but mix the furniture around, just change the elements of the memory.
Yes, you can raise that question. It's an interesting one, you see, but you see, we're in danger of painting ourselves into a corner by saying thought is all bad, right? You see, if you say thought is all bad, then we need something beside thought, right? But then how are you going to get it? You see, thought will never give it to you, and you will hope for a miracle, right?
Is there anything else but this conditioning? Isn't it?
But suppose I say there is, that's still thought. You see, I can say anything, right? I can say there's a great, glorious thing which we can all, which will solve all our problems, right? Yeah. But it's still thought. So we have got to do something else, you see.
You know, the only real problem in thought, the notion within thought that there's somebody who's thinking.
Well, that is so, but that's quite hard to get at because it seems so obvious that there is. You see, I hope we can get to that. You see, but we raised the question that thought is memory, right? Now, you see, that's an interesting point, you see, which may be a clue. That I want to distinguish between thinking and thought. Now, thinking is an active process, I say, which is actually going on. The word ing at the end, the syllable ing suggests something active. And thought is the past. Right? So when you say, when we have been thinking, we then suppose it all vanishes. And, you know, as thinking tells you what's right, you know, what the way things really are, and then you decide what to do, and you do it, and then it's all gone. Right? But in fact, I say thinking becomes thought, right? It goes on to a program. What you have been thinking, especially the conclusions and the assumptions, the general things like that, go onto a program. You see, if you've been thinking that people of that category are bad, it becomes a program, and you see them as bad, you'll respond immediately, right? If you tell your children that, that's the way they're going to behave automatically, right? It's the memory springs into action like a program. You don't have time to see it happening, and you think that's just the reality and the truth. Now, we need that because if you're going to drive a car, you have to do a lot of thought enters in. You learn all sorts of things that you ought to be doing. It becomes part of your program, right? So that you can respond immediately rather than have to think. You see, if you took time to think the response, it would be too late. So you need this possibility of making thought a program, in all sorts of ways, right? Yet it's dangerous, because this program, when you don't notice it, can spring into action and tell you these people are bad. I must kill such and such a person. Under such conditions, I must kill. Under such conditions, I must do this. I must do that. You know, I'm this sort of person. They're that sort of person. We'll never meet, and so on. You see, thought can tell you all that like a program, so that you see it that way. Is that clear? It affects your perception. It affects your whole attitude. It affects your adrenaline. You see, if for example, you're in a dark place and people have said there's assailants in this neighborhood, and you see a shadow, your thought immediately makes you jump, right? The fact that you know there is, if you didn't think there were any assailants, you would say nothing, right? So, or if you look again and see it's a shadow, it's all gone, you see. So thought, which is programmed from what people have said and what you've thought, what you've been thinking, acts immediately. It acts immediately in millions of ways. And this has been going on collectively as well as individually for ages, you see, and it's building up, as you have remarked.
It makes robots out of all of us.
It makes us at least have a lot of robotic characteristics, right? And we may not be well, if we say it, we have to be careful. If we don't know that it's true, we be careful not to say it, because that thought itself will make a robot out of us, do you see? That thought, a robot. You see, that thought will say, we are nothing but robots, and then we will be robots, right? You see, you have to watch out that the very thought we are using in this minute is very crucial. It may be the thought that's doing the whole thing, right?
All words are a limitation in a sense. So.
Well, but once again, if you say all words, we just better keep silent. You see, and then when we keep silent, we don't solve the problem either. You see, that's a way of using language which makes trouble. You see, the word all must be used very carefully because it is one of the most powerful programming words there is. Like all, you know, I don't know, you see, they're all of those people are that way, you know. It's forever, you'll be that way forever, you see, and so on. That has a tremendously powerful programming effect, right? So that means we must watch this language and say, generally speaking, there are times when we should use the word all, but we have to be careful, right? It can be a very powerful programming word. You see, so we have this thought, and we're saying the thought acts like a program. You have thinking and thought, right? Thinking is a bit more active because when you're thinking, you can detect incoherence sometimes, right? You can detect there's something wrong with what I'm thinking. But thought works so fast you can't do that. You see, so how do you detect that? You get a feeling, a sense something is wrong. You see, you require sensitivity to that, right? Now that sensitivity is crucial, and we won't have time for this evening, but I think society systematically destroys it in order to avoid being upset, right? I would rather have people not noticing incoherence because then you don't upset the apple cart too much. You see, so therefore we have learned to sort of cover that up. Now, but let's say we have this sensitivity which is very subtle, which can show us incoherence in our thought. You see, so we have thinking and thought. Now, then besides that we have feeling or motion, whatever you want to call it. Now, feeling is a very active, has the word ing at the end of it, the suffix, and that suggests something that's always active, right? And primary and real. But it's not true. You see, unfortunately, the English language is deficient in this regard. It has introduced the distinction of thinking and thought, but it has not made a corresponding distinction among feelings. I will do it for the moment now. I say there are feelings and felts. I mean, feelings you've had in the past have gone on the memory and become programs. You can remember feelings you've had, right? Feelings of traumatic events, feelings of pleasure, nostalgia, right? And all that stuff, right? And that has a powerful effect, right? You find it hard to distinguish some from genuine feeling. Let's say you get a genuine feeling of relationship, or in the jungle somebody might have got a feeling of danger, and then he's got to think, what does it mean? And let's say he sees a snake, what does it mean? He says, it's not a poisonous snake, it goes away, right? It is a poisonous snake, you'd better move, right? And so on. So there's a natural relation of feeling and thinking, that a feeling sort of picks up the perception first, and then the question arises, what does it mean? And thinking begins to supply that, right? Now, if it's working right, then thinking will show whether the feeling is appropriate or not. But it may not work right, you see. Now, we can get felts, right? Now, there's no easy way to deal with those. You see, if you had a lot of traumatic experience as a child with certain things, you get a felt every time something similar comes up, and you can't deal with it. You see, it's in the memory. You see, the natural intelligence might reach the feeling, but how is it going to reach the memory, the program? It doesn't know there's one there and doesn't know where it is, right? So you don't change it. You see, you're stuck with it, you see. So the point is that failure to understand that is a crucial difficulty in the whole process of thought. You see, in other words, what thought thinks about itself is very important because it conditions and programs itself in a wrong way. So the way in which thought programs itself to go wrong is the thing we have to look at. Now, it has programmed itself to go wrong as a result of a long history. Right? So we have the thinking and feeling, thinking and thought, feeling and felt, right? And the question is, how are we going to get at it? You see, I say that it's something very subtle. I think there are one or two more points. We just have for the evening. We don't want to go on too long. You see, there are things which are obvious and things which are subtle. Now, the word subtle means, highly refined, rarefied, elusive, delicate, undefinable. So I can't define subtle since it means undefinable. But its root is interesting, subtext, which means finely woven. In other words, you could say the mind makes more and more finely woven nets in which it could catch subtler and subtler things, right? Ordinary thought is not very subtle. Its net is very coarse, and a lot of things slip right through. Some of the questions we've been discussing slip right through. You see. So now what do we mean by subtlety? You will not be able to sense anything subtle without sensitivity, right? It's elusive, undefinable, delicate. You see, that calls for sensitivity. As I said, the society doesn't want too much sensitivity. You see, I'll give you an example. We knew there was some girl who was going to school, and she got this teacher was doing all sorts of incoherent things, I would call it, this crazy thing. She said this. It all doesn't make any sense. She was very disturbed, right? So the mother finally said, in this house, the teacher is always right. You see, it didn't mean she believed the teacher was right. She said, there's no point in your raising these issues. You're wasting your energy. But it illustrates the point that the whole society finally teaches the child that it's no point in being sensitive to all that incoherence because you get nowhere. Therefore, that child learns a more general lesson, not merely this and that incoherence, but all incoherence, right? Saying, don't notice these things, right? Don't pay too much attention. Don't take them too seriously because you'll get in trouble and you'll get nowhere, right? And you see, now, therefore, the society, in order to stabilize itself, systematically, not this society only, almost all that we know of over history, have systematically destroyed sensitivity, which is necessary for intelligence, right? For subtle intelligence. You see, the kind of thought we've been talking about is not very subtle. You see, it's pretty crude and gross. And we need subtlety, and we need sensitivity. You see, now, does everybody, but you see, can we have a formula for becoming sensitive? What would you say?
A whole way of life.
What?
Has to be a whole way of life.
It's your whole life is involved, not just this or that, right?
Not to be brutalized to begin with.
Yeah, but if you are, what are you going to do? You see, most of us are, you see, so we've got to change, you see. At least maybe we can, right? If we assume that we can't, then that finishes it, right? See, thought is very powerful. By saying this is impossible, that blocks it. So it's a wrong tactic or a wrong strategy to start with the assumption that what we want to do is impossible. It doesn't prove that it is possible, but at least we have to leave it open.
Talk a little bit more, please, about what you mean by sensitivity.
Yes, it's hard to explain, but suppose we take the case of this girl who the teacher is doing all sorts of things that don't make sense, right? So they're sort of disturbing her, right? Now, what's happening? How is she feeling? There's some feelings that come up when something happens that doesn't make sense. I don't know what. You see, suppose you're coming into a room and you say, "There's something wrong in this room." I can't say exactly what. You sense it. Then you begin to ask, what could it be, and what does it mean, and so on. Maybe then you find it.
I would suggest that you wouldn't do that. That you would sense the feeling that you have and not have to put it into content. Because as soon as you put it into content, it's locked. And that's where we get caught in thought, or we get caught in the content, and we don't have any space behind it to see that that becomes the reality, which obviously cannot be. There's an interpretation.
But sometimes we must. You see, for example, if say you have a machine and it's not quite working, you sense something is wrong here, it doesn't look quite right, or you have a problem in mathematics, you sense there's a contradiction somewhere and you can't tell where. You see, there are times when you want to find out what it is, right? Now, there may be other times when it's not necessary.
Well, in your suggestion then, what you're doing is you're actually playing with it. You're not coming to a conclusion.
No.
When you find a machine that isn't working, you have to look at it. You have to take it apart. So you actually are working back and forth with that feeling and then with thought. If you come into a room and you say, "Gee, I feel something funny here," I bet it's because, and then I'm finished.
Oh, no,
And
don't
then
do that, no.
See, that's where the difference between the sensitivity comes in. You don't come to a conclusion or don't have a content. You play with it. You just let it ride.
Go ahead. Yes, don't come to a conclusion. The idea is you hold back for a little while. You see, it's necessary to suspend the action.
Yes.
And we'll come to that later. This suspension is crucial to sensitivity. You say, I don't decide, I don't say this or that, but I'm looking and I'm trying to find out, right?
And thought will come up,
Yeah.
or thinking will be happening, and that can be perhaps trusted or not, but you keep that open.
Oh, yeah.
And you let the next thing come along and see if that validates what the thought that came up, and it's a whole process like that.
Yeah, so thought can work together with sensitivity, you see. So see, that begins to show thought isn't always the villain, you see. You see, it has gone wrong, badly wrong in the whole of history, but it needn't be the villain, you see. Now, and we need this sensitivity, which is the beginning of something beyond thought, right? In other words, thought and what is beyond thought don't necessarily just stand on two sides of the fence, saying, here's the fence, since thought is here and non-thought is over there. But you see, they sort of meet, right? So it may be that by following this, we will get beyond thought, you see, in some fundamental way. I mean, so our minds are open, right? We don't know. You see, we have to start. Don't say, I'm going to tell you I know and you don't know, and I'm going to tell you. and when you come out of here, you'll know too.
Sensitivity is other than thought?
It's not other. It's beyond. It's a bit beyond the thought as a program, right? The word thought means the program, basically. Now, but when sensitivity enters, then thought itself begins to have new possibilities, right?
It's usually thought that destroys sensitivity.
Well, a certain kind of thought, right? That thought which is trying to defend something very precious. Saying, this must not be touched, right? That kind of thought.
Say you walk in a room and you get a feeling something's wrong, and you say, oh, it's just my imagination, then you've immediately used
Yeah, well, you may not want to be bothered, you see. You say, we've too much trouble to go into all this, and you see, there are all sorts of reasons which thought could give you why you shouldn't be sensitive, right? On the other hand, you could not be too sensitive. Thought can make you sensitive in a wrong way by making you very touchy, you see. So it's a very subtle question. See, this comes back to the fact that we have got to get into something subtle, which requires another level of sensitivity again, right? You see.
Sensitivity, a potential faculty that has the quality of freshness and not the kind of the frozen of the thought, programming thought. It's sensitivity is something present, fresh, spontaneous, awakened. That's maybe the distinction with the programmed thought. Of course, sensitivity is using the relative thought, but it seems to me at the moment that it has a freshness. It's something that springs out and has an aliveness.
Yes, it's much more alive. It's tentative. It's it's undefined. You see, it's subtle. You see, it's like the word subtle means finally undefinable, but elusive, delicate. You see, all those words could be applied to sensitivity.
But does it keep all the senses alert?
Yes, and that's a good point. That I would say that we ordinarily think of the senses as one thing and sensitivity as another, but I would say without sensitivity, the senses cannot give you much information of value, you see. You will merely pick up what you're used to, you see, and therefore you could now say the senses are an extension of sensitivity in certain directions, but the fundamental quality is sensitivity, right? Which may be in the mind as well as in the senses.
Could you say it's a kind of looking before you leap?
Well, that's sometimes it is, but primarily it's a kind of, being open to, you see, I think it's natural, but it's being destroyed by thought which says you shouldn't be sensitive, right? But you should be well determined for certain purposes, right?
Could it be that the sensitivity is related more to the perception, which is devoid of the memory bank of thought? And once thought acts on that perception, it alters.
Yes, well, sensitivity is the first step toward perception. It's the beginning of picking up new information, you see, which is not in the categories of thought, right? But at the same time, it's sensitive to thought too, right? Now, see, I'll just finish on this one point, then we won't go into it thoroughly. In a way, what destroys sensitivity is what I would call a generalized idea of violence, you see. I'll just say a few things about violence now, and I think you can see that it brings it all together. Perhaps we'll come back to it in the next periods. But you see, the word violent, according to the dictionary, means the undue use of force. In other words, it doesn't mean you should never use force to push something around, but in the wrong place, right? And it also is related to the word violate. You're violating the right order, you see, and so on. Now, now, the point is, the basic form of violence is that his action is determined by thought, right? Now, however bad it is, it's determined by some kind of thought. But at some stage, we respond with force, right? We respond to thought with force, right? As if we could obliterate it or push it aside or change it or something, right? Now, that force may be more subtle, it may be just mental force rather than physical force, right? But it does not meet the thought itself, right? Its content. You see what I mean? That now, so that, for example, somebody is doing something that frustrates you very much, it blocks what you want to do, and you say, you make a picture of him as that person who's always doing that, right? And you say he needs to be pushed aside or hit, or something should be said to him sharp, or you can also produce violence as an undue use of mental force. See, the word convince means to win. It's a kind. The word persuade is based on suave and sweet. It means to win by sweet talk, but that is also a form of violence, right? It does not meet the actual issue. See, persuasion and conviction can be regarded as subtle forms of violence, right? Now, really, ultimately, what's called for is simply these thoughts must meet, and we must see whether they're coherent or not, and what their value is, right? So, if you don't like what the other side is doing, say the communist or capitalist or religion, you form the image of them as wicked, and you say, they're always that way, they only understand force, right? That's a typical thing you say, which, of course, nobody understands force. So it will create the sense that if somebody responds to you with force, when you will feel that you have been violently treated too, you see, right? If they don't listen to you. If people don't listen, you'll feel that's a form of violence, right? And then you get into a complex problem, because you may see somebody else's violence and you say it's his violence, right? But it's really yours as well, you see, because you cannot see his violence except in terms of your own. You see your own tendency to use force, undue force, right? Inwardly or outwardly or somewhere, you see. So suppose you're watching a television program with a violent content. There's nothing going on there at all except spots of light, but you can feel the violence in the program, right? But where is it coming from? It's coming from your own violence, right? You see, each person has been programmed to violence over the ages, and everybody's got plenty of violent programs in it. There's no difficulty in finding a violent program to project into the image or to project into this image of somebody else, right? And therefore, the point is that, first of all, if you see violence, you see it through your own, but then you don't want to admit, you want to say that's terrible, it's disturbing, so you then say, deny that it's mine and say it's that person's, right? And you feel better, but the violent movement is still in there, right? Which will come out in another way and distorting your thought, right? You see, so therefore, And we also have a thought which says that I am justified in responding to violence with violence, right? I respond to good to friendship with friendship, and to violence with violence. That's an accepted thought. But that thought cannot actually work overall in the long run. It must be sure destruction. It destroys all sides, you see. Because once you respond with violence, you're turning your own system into chaos, you see, and everything you do goes wrong. Now has no meaning. So the thing is then that this is a very subtle point, right? It requires a lot of sensitivity to see it. But of course, violence is constantly destroying that sensitivity. You see, your violent reaction is smashing you up inside, so you're not sensitive, right? You're not only not sensitive to that, you're not sensitive to almost anything else, and you do all sorts of things wrong. You see, so so you could see this, that one of the basic difficulties with thought is violence. You see, the other side of violence is fear. You see, when you think you've got a lot of force, you don't hesitate to be violent, to use force to overcome. But when you don't think you have that force, then you're afraid, right? You try to retreat. And the point is that fear and violence are closely connected, because you can then project your own violence into the other person, and you're afraid of it, right? So therefore, the two go together, right? They're just two sides of that one process. And you could see it physically, violence is a tremendous problem, but mentally it's a much more serious problem. You see, you can see violence in the way people insist on their view and simply dismiss anything else, right? That will provoke violence. You see, I saw a program about, there's the Northern and Southern Irish, and we know all the violence going on there, but there was an election in Southern Ireland as to whether they should have a very limited form of divorce, and that was rejected totally. Now, you could see they showed talking with people, there was that absolute conviction, that it simply dismissed any other point of view. Now, and this fellow pointed out that was a tremendous blow against the unity with the North that they wanted, you see. That the minute the Protestants in the North would see that, they would say, well, we could never unite with them. They simply dismiss anything. Even on this little issue, they won't move, right? You see, so the violence in thought is the root fundamentally of all that violence with guns, right? You see, so and I want to say that thought, which does not understand what it is doing, tends to fall into violence. Right? Now, in the primitive times, this happened much less frequently. People were further apart, living in small groups, and it didn't matter so much because the weapons they had were not so dangerous anyway. Now, we have very dangerous weapons, and at the same time, if we're violent, we're going to not be able to get together to meet this ecological crisis and all sorts of things we have to do together. So I think it'd be worth looking into, being sensitive to violence, your own violence, other people, in all its forms, because violence is basically the movement which destroys sensitivity. So we could say, if we are insensitive, we have to be sensitive to what is destroying sensitivity. That would be the only way out, right? Now, therefore, we could say that rather than condemning violence or saying I mustn't be violent, or I must be violent, or I justify violence, saying that if he treats me violently, then I'm justified, or else I must turn the other cheek, or I must do this or that. You see, none of that gets to the root that thought is the source of violence, right? See, these are all attempts, the typical of thought, to produce a problem and then to produce some means of overcoming the problem that it's constantly producing. You see, that it's like hitting yourself on the head with a hammer with the right hand and trying to stop it with the left, you see. That you continue the thought, the kind of thought that makes violence, and then you say we ought not to be violent, you see. So that just simply muddles it up, right? It's another kind of violence. You see, thought turns violently against itself, right? Violence turns against itself, but remains violence as it does so. Now I think it's worth thinking about that. It's a way of thinking, looking, not really thinking, which and being sensitive, which gives some insight if you pursue it. That you can see that a tremendous amount of the confusion in your own thought is a kind of violence with which thought is attacking those parts of itself that it doesn't like. Now, you're going to say, we're going to have to go into what will you do if you find yourself full of things you don't like in yourself, you see. We have to go into all that. You know, violence will do no good, right? Now, ignoring it will do no good, right? So we have got to have an approach which, you know, and I think there is an approach which can, you know, get into it. And which means going further into thought and what it, you know, how it goes and so on. Now,
is this violence sort of rooted in the need of thought to feel it's always correct or right?
well, that's part of its root. That certainly is part of it. Also the need to feel secure, to be sure.
So it has to believe these coarse generalizations.
Yes, it's really one of those nets that is very coarse. You see, with the violent nets are extremely coarse. Not subtle. No.
So speedy, because it labels things quickly.
Yeah, very, very fast emotional reactions. And there was some months ago in the New York Times saying that there are two ways that emotion could be dealt with. See, one way is that the whole system, the brain, including the intellect, can sort of evaluate the emotion and see whether it makes sense or not. But there's another faster way, which is that which apparently was useful in primitive times, that in situations of danger there can be a very fast turning on of the emotion very powerfully. And memory can do that, you see, say the memory of certain dangers. But then the memory of our whole conditioning does it too, you see. Yeah. Now, so we have to say that adds to violence, right? That's part of the movement of violence.
Maybe speak to, or maybe this is my own conclusion, it's not true, but I sense that the physical fear is far less than our psychological fear.
Yes, we could say that there would be reasonable physical fears that wouldn't confuse, they wouldn't disorganize us. You see, in the primitive situation, the fear might get you to run from the animal if you can't handle it, and then when you're finished, when you run away, it stops, right? Or if the animal catches you and he eats you and it stops too. You see, it doesn't go on forever, right? On the other hand, our present fears about thought go on forever. You see, a person is afraid, will I hold my job? Will the boss, like me? Now that goes on forever, and it starts to degenerate the brain, right? See, the kind of psychological fear, the physical fear may be a reaction to a perceived danger, but the psychological fear is something much more subtle and complex, you see, which we have to get into.
The development of thought has increased our psychological fear, the development of thought.
Yes, the more thought develops, the more things we have to be afraid of, you see. Both in reality and imaginary. You see, because we produced all kinds of dangers, like the nuclear danger, the ecological danger, you see, due to the way we think, and at the same time, there are a tremendous number of, they are real dangers, but produced by confused thinking, by incoherent thinking, right?
Sensitivity different from the program, because sensitivity happens in the moment, in the now, and the now is a perception, and it's real. Like fear, it could be a program, because the word fear makes you fearful. And also fear might cause a pain in the body. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the pain now, you see that the pain is different. You think it's fear, but because you're accustomed to having a feeling when the word fear is expressed, and the body always reacts the same way. It reacts to a program.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it in the now, something happens, because the now then, as I understand it, what you said beyond the brain, the now is beyond the brain, or it's out of time.
Yes, I think that may well be so, but I think that we could get into it in the wrong way, in the sense to before, you see, that could become another pattern of program, you see. In other words, whatever you say, whether it's true or false or whatever, can go onto the program and become a source of imagination, right? Now, I think we have to be careful to go slowly to see that danger, to see how can we proceed without getting into that situation, and to actually come to into contact with this process of thought in its deceptive movement sufficiently so that we don't fall into that trap. You see, even something which is very true, when just stated, can become a trap, right? If it just goes on the program. You see, so I'm saying the first step is not truth, but can we see what's the meaning of what's going on, right? See, if we don't see this meaning clearly, then we'll never have a mind which can get to truth, right? Have truth. That we have to see the meaning of this thought process, which now we have a wrong meaning.
Can we never have truth then? From what you just said, I don't know whether we ever can have truth.
No, we won't have truth, but let's say, are we going to be in truth, you know? Yes, we'll have to discuss this whole question of truth, because I think that's part of the confusion of thought. That thought has very confused the incoherent notions of truth, which go into the program and trap us, you see. Because once you say something is true, this gives it tremendous power. So if the program says this is true, it takes right over, right? And that's the surest way to make the program take over, is just to put it down and say that's true, right?
Problem is that we never can get any consensus on the meaning of any specific meaning.
Well, we'll go into that too. You see, that's where the dialogue comes in, where we will see if we, I don't know if we can do it all in this short period, but to raise the question of whether we can share a meaning. So we have to say both individually, we have to get our meaning clear, coherent, and collectively. Right? Now, this, as I said, this is a rather, to do all this is a rather short period in 2 more days. But we will try to do something, you see. I mean, we'll have to make a selection. We can't cover the whole thing in all detail, right? Right, well, I think then that if unless somebody has an urgent question, I'll call a halt for tonight, and we'll start tomorrow morning at 10, right?
Born with a tendency of programming deceiving thought? Are we born with that tendency of the deceiving thought?
Well, I don't know if we're born with the possibility that it may go wrong, you see.
The difference between conditioning and learning, you seem to use those things interchangeably. And the question of whether we're born with it or whether it's something, this process is something we learn.
Well, we have learned it, but it's now part of our culture. So it's transmitted very quickly.
Human learning, that's picking it up though, not just a passive.
Yeah, we've learned something which is destructive, you see. And it has become part of our culture.
We're programming things that we need not program, like if we need to program things like to step back and not step on a rattlesnake. That's a part of programming we need. Or maybe more common and not step out of the way of a truck coming down the road. We need that kind of programming.
Yeah, the child must be taught that, you see.
But the other kinds of programming.
But then we have to say, how do we draw the line? And see, and we have to go into it. We'll not be able to draw the line intelligently unless we see what is wrong with the other kind. You see, if you merely say that's the bad kind of program, this is the good kind, then that's the same story again, right? Do all the good things and keep away from the bad things. That's what they tell you, right? Now, you see, that sort of advice simply muddles it up, right? See, because then what are the good things and what are the bad things? You see, there is something specifically incoherent about this way this program works, which we have to get into.
This thought and thinking into death.
What?
This thought and thinking into death.
Well, I assume it does.
That implies there's another. If thought and thinking end at death, and there is a consciousness or survival of something, consciousness or intelligence, there's an implication that there's another intelligence operating even as we think.
It may well be. You see, I'm not denying it. I'm saying it may be, and maybe we'll come to it. But I think we can't begin with the assumption, you see, because that's, again, the way the program works, right? If we assume it, then we will create the impression that it's there when it's not actually working, right? You see, the assumption is the trap, huh?
When you mentioned sensitivity, there's an assumption that there's something other than thinking that's operating, that's bringing us back.
You can look at it you can look at it as an assumption that is very provisional, that we're going to explore sensitively, you see. In other words, I'm not going to take this as saying this is the truth, right? But I'm saying we all know sensitivity, a little bit about it, right? And it does imply something beyond, we don't know what, right? And if we're sensitive to this assumption, we want to explore this assumption, or call it what you will, it's a proposal rather than an assumption, right? I would rather use the word proposal, right? Explore this proposal sensitively. Do you see what I'm driving at? So it's there to be looked at and explored, right? We cannot say this is the truth, that there really is an intelligence. We really know that there is an intelligence beyond the thought, right? If I began with that, then we would have the wrong beginning, right? Do you see what I mean?
We're saying, proposing that the ultimate violence and the cause of all the violence in the world is this destruction of our sensitivity.
Yeah, that's the proposal which we have to explore with sensitivity, you see. So in that case, we are going to bring in the very sensitivity that we're going to be learning about, right?
Sensitive about this activity.
Yeah, and about our way of exploring it, right?
We have to tiptoe.
Well, it's a matter of being sort of somewhat, not rushing to conclusions, and also being open to, you see, the sensitivity might include sensitivity of the body. I mean, how does thought affect the feelings in the body? How does it affect the solar plexus and the neck and the stomach? How does it produce tensions in the abdominal walls? And you see, all of these things are part of the meaning of thought, which we must go into, right? See, in other words, sensitivity means we don't restrict it and say this is thought, that is something else. Right? But one flows into the other, you see. See, thought has produced this whole world, so we have to see that whole process. We're not going to make a sharp boundary between thought and everything else. If you do make that boundary, that blocks sensitivity.
Tendency to put everything in conclusions blocks sensitivity. There's a tendency to put everything in conclusions.
That's right.
It's like that closes all the doors.
Now, can you see that this tendency to put too much into conclusions is a form of violence? Yeah. It is violating the right order, you see. It is trying by some forceful means to close the issue when it's not closed. You see, conclusion means closing it, and there's a place where you can close it, but you're trying to close what cannot be closed, right? And that is violence. You're using force, a kind of very forceful thought, you see.
You even say when you ask that question, and this was too quick to say yes, would be another violence.
What?
When you said, can you see that that just creates a violence?
Mm-hmm.
And then I just go, yeah. In a sense, that's cutting off. If it's just an answer,
Yeah.
then I stop looking.
No, I'm saying if you have looked and felt it is a kind of violence, then say yes, then it means something, right? You say, I see that it is a kind of violence, right? Or I have seen, right? You know, that would be the fact, right? See, suppose I say, I hear that question and I... What?
Yes, that would be so. But then it may tend to stop you from looking.
Well, not if you're just saying, I have seen that it's a form of violence, you see, and I can now go further. And I say, what does it mean? You see, what does it imply? Can we go further? And saying, you know, that's a very interesting point, isn't it, that merely making a conclusion can be a form of violence. Maybe there could be other things we accept so readily which are also violent, right?
So what she's saying is that a positive assertion is just as much of a closure as a negative
It can be, but not every positive assertion is a closure, do you see?
Yes, I just was wondering if that could be seen.
Yeah.
Because I can see my violence and then stop seeing it because I have found...
Oh yeah, well, you've settled it, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. No, we're saying it obviously isn't settled. If I say I have seen that my conclusions are a form of violence, and I say that doesn't settle anything, that means it's the beginning of the inquiry. Because that's a tremendous point, saying I've been concluding all the time and so has everybody else, and we all thought we were just doing nice logical thought, right? But it turns out very often we were engaging in subtle violence.
But that means that the thought that was doing the conclusions all of a sudden can have a glimpse of what it's doing.
Yeah, well, maybe you can even glimpse why you're doing it, you see, but perhaps we should try to go into that a little later. You know, you get a sense of what's making you do it, but that would go further. You see, that's another question, right? See, what makes me engage in such incoherent activity? What is the impulse?
See, sensitivity is a kind of openness, opening kind of process.
Yes, I mean, that's glasnost. That connects with the fellow who said, whoever said we should discuss what's going on in Eastern Europe.
The person that says, oh, I have an open mind. I listen to everything because I don't want to come to closure and there's no conclusions. Without discrimination.
Oh, that fellow has done it already. You see, he has said that that's what I am. You see, he said that he's defined himself as the one who's always listening to this thing and never coming to a conclusion. Now, clearly, you must sometimes come to a conclusion, right? And he's defined. If you say, I never come to a conclusion, you're still violent, right? Because you are violently opposed to coming to conclusions. You see, the point is you're open to coming to conclusions where necessary. You couldn't live without sometimes coming to a conclusion, right? You see, that means subtlety. You see, not just making a sharp boundary like that and saying it's this or that.
Conclusion, isn't it?
What?
Making that statement that I am always open.
Yeah, that's a conclusion, and it's a violent kind of conclusion, right? You see, if you say you've got to be open always, then that's you're enforcing something, right? You're using a kind of moral force, right? You see, because you can use moral force as well as physical force, or force, mental force, you know, force of very powerful expression.
Get carried away, I guess they could say the statement I am is a kind of a conclusion.
Well, maybe it is, you see, but suppose if we feel that way, then we must inquire, you see, and say, is it, you know, what are we doing, right? What does it really mean?
I don't see anything necessarily wrong with coming to a conclusion, relatively speaking. It's just sort of a stepping stone, and then from there you move on. But if you just stop there, that's where it's dangerous.
Well, if you stop permanently,
yeah.
You may have to stop for a while, you see, or quite a while, right? See, there's no limit to how long. You see, you could conclude that gold has such and such a specific gravity, and we expect to hold that indefinitely, right? But we can see, of course, but that wasn't entirely true because there are isotopes of gold were discovered which have another specific gravity. So it had to change, right? Right. Well, then perhaps we'll call a halt on and start tomorrow morning.